My name is Glories, and sometimes it feels like my whole life has become one endless list of tasks, reminders, and errands that are impossible to complete in 24 hours. I'm 32, a software developer at a large tech company, and in theory, I should have a stable, peaceful life, a job I love, my own home, a little solitude, and a cup of hot coffee in the morning when it's still dark outside and the house is quiet. But silence is a rare guest in my house, ever since I switched to remote work. Everyone has assumed that if I work from home, I don't work at all, especially my family. My mom and dad are retired and live nearby, but they always assume I'm home anyway and can help my sister, and Michelle, my older sister, who is 37, views my house as a backup daycare. After the divorce 2 years ago, she certainly put on a brave face, trying to smile, saying everything was under control, that she was happy to be a free woman, but I could see how hard it was for her. 3 children, Alex, a 9-year-old with a quiet, thoughtful look and an adult weariness in his eyes, Emma, 7, with her endless questions and whims, and Tyler, a 6-year-old whirlwind who couldn't sit still for a minute. After the divorce, Michelle decided to start dating again. I can't be alone, Glories, I need someone, she'd say, clutching a glass of wine in my kitchen and absent-mindedly watching Emma pour juice on the table, and I understand she wanted love, support, some kind of future. But every time she went on a date, the kids ended up at my place. At first, it seemed temporary, well, a few hours, no big deal, but I was even glad I could spend time with my nephews. Alex helped me in the kitchen, Emma drew me portraits, and Tyler was always pilfering my old TV remote, thinking it was a toy. But over time, those few hours turned into entire days, then weekends, and before I knew it, I'd become the one essentially raising them. Alex learned to make his own sandwiches. Emma brought me a book every night to read to her before bed, and Tyler started calling me Mama Glories, and every time he said it, my heart sank because I didn't know how to explain to him that I wasn't his mother, that I was just their mother's sister, who once wanted a quiet life. Michelle, meanwhile, seemed to live in another dimension. She rented an apartment 20 minutes away, worked 20 hours a week at some marketing firm, and received a hefty child support payment from her ex-husband. I helped her financially, my parents helped too, and everything seemed to be going smoothly, but deep down I felt this balance was hanging by a thin thread. My nerves, my fatigue, my sense of duty. Every day began the same way. I'd wake up at 6 in the morning, pour myself a cup of coffee, and sit down at my laptop while the house was quiet. An hour and a half was all I could snatch before the doorbell rang, and Michelle, out of breath, with the kids and backpacks, would quickly say, "Sis, I'm running, you're the best, I love you," and disappear. Then chaos ensued, breakfast, arguing over who would wash their hands first, searching for lost socks, checking to see if anyone had forgotten their lunchbox, and finally the trip to school, after which I'd return and try to get back to work, but my brain was already racing. After school, lessons, homework, math with Alex, reading with Emma, endless attempts to explain to Tyler that the number 8 isn't written as 2 circles one on top of the other, then dinner, bath, teeth, pajamas, bedtime, and only when the clock approached 10 could I open my laptop and start working in earnest. And every time I looked at the lines of code, I thought, now I'll finish this project, and then I'll talk to Michelle, I'll tell her I can't do this anymore. But in the morning, it all started again. A week ago, on Wednesday, I got a call from her while I was sitting in a meeting with my boss, trying not to fall asleep from exhaustion. "Glories, I need you to come to Mom and Dad's for dinner on Saturday," she said in a voice as if she were calling me to an awards ceremony. "I have something important to announce. The whole family needs to be there." I tried to joke. "Are you getting married again?" But she answered briefly, almost solemnly, "No, not over the phone, it has to be in person. Believe me, you'll be interested to hear this." I nodded silently, although she didn't see it, and hung up, a strange feeling spreading in my chest, a mixture of hope and anxiety. Maybe she'd finally met someone who would help her, who would understand what responsibility was, who could shoulder this burden at least a little. And if that's true, then maybe I'll finally be able to just get some sleep. Saturday arrived, and as the clock approached 5, I was already behind the wheel, looking down the road that led to my parents' house, trying to convince myself that everything would be fine, that maybe something good would actually happen today, that I could at least spend the evening without the irritation and fatigue that had become my constant companions. But as soon as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed not only Michelle's car parked outside the house but also another, unfamiliar one. A silver sedan, clearly not cheap, but also not new, with a small dent in the rear bumper. For some reason, this made my insides clench, a premonition, subtle but unpleasant, as if someone quietly warned me that this evening would change everything. As I entered the house, the familiar smell of Mom's roast and freshly baked bread hit my nose. The children were already running around the living room, and Michelle was sitting on the couch next to a man I hadn't seen before. He looked to be about 30, average height, with a short haircut, a nervous smile, and his hands folded in his lap as if he were afraid of accidentally knocking something out of place. "Glories!" Michelle cried, jumping up and hugging me with an overly enthusiastic glint in her eyes. "I'm so glad you came. This is Derek." She turned to the man, who immediately stood up, extended his hand, and said with a slight accent, "Nice to meet you. Michelle's told me a lot about you." I shook his hand, smiled briefly, "Nice to meet you too," and sat down, feeling an unnatural politeness hang in the air, as if everyone had rehearsed this moment beforehand. Mom and Dad emerged from the kitchen, everyone sat at the table, and dinner began as usual. The children were surprisingly calm, even Tyler sat up straight and chewed silently, which was a miracle in itself. Maybe I should have been wary then, because in our family, silence at the table always foreshadowed a storm. Some were halfway through dinner, when the conversation had finally petered out and a ringing silence hung between the clink of forks and the muffled sounds of chewing. I couldn't take it anymore. "Okay, Michelle," I said, looking straight at her, "what's this big announcement you've gathered the whole family for?" She cleared her throat slightly, placed her hand on Derek's, and suddenly lit up, as if someone had turned on a lamp inside her. "Well, hello everyone," she said with a dramatic pause. "Derek and I have some wonderful news to share," and after a second's pause, she added, almost in a whisper, but with triumph in her voice, "I'm pregnant, and we're getting married soon." Silence fell on the room like a tightly closed door. 5 seconds, maybe 10, and suddenly her parents screamed with joy and rushed to hug her. Mom burst into tears, Dad clapped Derek on the shoulder, and I sat there as if I'd been scalded with boiling water. I couldn't get a word out. My sister, who barely managed 3 children, working 20 hours a week, living on child support and my transfers, was now going to have a 4th child. I tried to wrap my head around it, but inside there was only a ringing confusion. "Congratulations," I finally exhaled, forcing a smile. "Wow, that's great news." Michelle nodded, and then, slightly casually, as if in passing, added, "Thank you, Glories, but that's not all." She turned to me and smiled that calm, confident smile of hers, the one that made my palms itch. "I already knew what was coming. I need you to take care of the kids for a few months while I go through pregnancy and recovery." I nearly choked on my water. "What?" I asked, looking at her as if she'd just told me she was going to Mars. "Temporarily, of course," she continued evenly, "so I can focus on my health, on the baby, and then, after the birth, I'll need time to adjust." I set the glass down on the table, slowly, so as not to throw it. "Michelle, are you serious?" I asked. Her smile faded. "Excuse me," she replied quietly, a hurt note now. "You expect me to take care of your 3 kids for months? On top of everything I already do for them? I feed them, I take them to school, I do their homework, I buy them clothes, pay for their activities, I practically live their lives while you're busy arranging yours." Michelle's eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe you're so selfish, Glories. All I'm asking is for you to help me through a difficult time, and you act like we're strangers." I turned to my parents, expecting them to set the record straight as usual, but my mother looked at me as if I'd just said something shameful. "Glories, you don't have children of your own," she said coldly. "You don't understand how hard it is to raise them." I gripped the edge of the table. "Don't understand?" I repeated quietly. "For the past year, I've been caring for Michelle's children every day. I wake up before the sun so I can work before they wake up. I put them to bed, I live with them, what exactly is it I don't understand? Dad interjected, calmly, but with that special tone that always irritated me the most. That's different, Michelle needs our support right now. What about my support? I blurted out, what about my life, my work, my sleep? Or don't I have the right to be tired? Mom shook her head. If Michelle wants to have another child, she should be able to do so without criticism from her family, she said, looking at me like I was a rebellious teenager. I stood up slowly, feeling my insides boiling, then let her do it without my help, I said, trying not to scream. I grabbed my purse, a chair scraped across the floor, and the children froze in fear. Michelle burst into tears, Mom screamed my name. Dad said something about family responsibilities, but I was already heading for the door, clutching my keys so tightly the metal bit into my palm. I drove home furious, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my insides seething with resentment and bewilderment, as if the world had gone mad and everyone close to me had suddenly decided I was simply obligated to have no boundaries. By the time I finally got home, it was already past 8, and my phone was literally shaking with incessant notifications, one message after another. As if every family member had decided to launch an attack on me. The first, of course, was Michelle. You're a terrible sister, how can you be so selfish? Then Mom, Glories, you should be ashamed, it's your duty to help your family. And then Dad, Michelle needs support now, not criticism, you're being unreasonable. I stared at the screen, feeling sick with each new line, but I didn't answer any of them, not a word, because I knew they'd turn any excuse I made into another excuse to accuse me of heartlessness. I simply placed the phone face down and, for the first time in a long time, allowed myself silence. I tried to convince myself that they would cool off, that they would finally understand how ridiculous Michelle's request was. After all, it wasn't just help, it was taking on 3 children for months, maybe a year, while she gave birth, recovered, fell in love again, and got her personal life together. I closed my eyes, turned off the phone, not on silent, but completely, to a black screen, and went to bed. For the first time in months, I actually fell asleep early, without the constant feeling of guilt about not getting everything done, without the baby's cries from the next room, without the worry that someone wanted something from me again. The next week was strangely quiet, almost unnaturally, not a single call, not a single message, not a single visit. Michelle didn't bring the kids, my parents didn't call to lecture me on family values, just me, my laptop, coffee, and a blessed silence that I was even afraid to break with music at first. I got up at 6, sat down to work. And everything went perfectly, as if life finally belonged to me again. I got everything done, reports, code, deadlines. For the first time in a year, I delivered all my projects on time, and my boss even wrote that he wanted to recommend me for a bonus, for excellent work and professional composure. I smiled when I read that letter, because this self-control had come at the cost of a near-nervous breakdown, but still, I felt proud. Finally, I was myself again, I was in control again. But, of course, I should have known it wouldn't last. Happiness in our family was always something like a temporary truce before another storm. That Saturday, for the first time in months, I allowed myself to sleep in. The house was quiet, the sun was streaming through the blinds, and I was beginning to think the day was shaping up to be normal when suddenly there was a loud, insistent knocking. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the knocking came again, heavy, impatient, as if someone was trying to break down the door. I looked at my watch, 7 in the morning, my heart jumped, and I went downstairs, in my pajamas, my hair disheveled, went to the door, and peered through the peephole. Alex, Emma, and Tyler were standing on the porch, each carrying suitcases, real, packed suitcases. Alex had that blue backpack with a NASA patch sewn on, Emma was holding a pink suitcase with princesses on it, and Tyler was clutching a tattered teddy bear to his chest. I threw open the door, and the chill of the morning air rushed into the house. What are you doing here? I asked, incredulous. The children looked frightened, confused, as if they didn't understand what was happening. Alex held his sister's hand protectively and quietly replied, Mom brought us here. She said to wait 5 minutes and then knock. I froze. What do you mean, brought us? Where is she? I asked. Alex looked down. She put our suitcases by the door and said you'd take care of us, then she left. My head spun. She left you here? Alone? My voice wavered. We weren't alone for long, Alex said quickly, as if defending his mother, but we didn't know what to do. I took a deep breath, gathered the kids, brought them into the house, sat them on the couch, turned on cartoons, poured them orange juice, and poured them cereal. Emma sat silently, staring into her bowl. Tyler was still clutching his teddy bear, and Alex tried to pretend everything was under control, but I could see his hands shaking. Then I called Michelle. 1 ring, 2, 3, 10, and only then, a short sigh and an irritated voice. What? I almost screamed. Michelle, you left 3 children on my porch. Without adult supervision. Anything could have happened to them. She yawned into the phone. Oh, please, Glories, it was only 5 minutes, you were going to take them anyway. After all, I almost dropped the phone. Are you out of your mind? I said, suppressing the urge to scream. Look, Glories, I know you, she continued calmly. You'll give in and help me. You always do. Kids need stability. Stability? I asked. Is that what you call stability, dropping them off at the door like a parcel? She didn't answer, only said wearily, come to your senses and pick them up. Derek and I have plans today, and then she hung up. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, phone in hand, feeling a rage pulsing in my chest, so pure and searing it made me want to laugh. I immediately called my mom. Mom, Michelle just dropped the kids off on my porch and left. They were standing there with their suitcases. There was a pause on the other end, then a calm voice. Glories, your sister is trying to build a life with Derek, right now. She needs to focus on her relationship. I couldn't believe my ears. What if we focus on her children, Mom? The ones she already has? The answer was short. I see. You need to stop being so selfish and just help your family. I lowered my hand with the phone and stared at the wall, unable to comprehend how all of this had become my reality. 20 minutes later, there was another knock on the door. At first, I thought Michelle had changed her mind, but when I opened it, I saw 2 police officers. One was tall, with short hair, the other younger, holding a notepad. Ms. Wilson, the older one asked. I nodded. We received a call. They said you were planning to abandon your 3 children. I froze, unable to utter a word. What? This is crazy. This is completely wrong. I finally managed to choke out. The young police officer looked at the recording. The caller said you were going to kick your nephews out of the house. I stood in the middle of the living room, still unable to believe what was happening. The police, the real police, in my house, because of Michelle, because of my own sister, who seemed to have decided that the easiest way to get me to comply was to accuse me of something I didn't do. I felt my heart pounding in my throat, and I barely kept my hands from shaking as I said, Officers, this is a misunderstanding. It wasn't like that at all. My sister brought her children here this morning and simply left them unattended on my porch. The senior officer raised an eyebrow, looked at the children standing next to me, clutching toys and suitcases, and asked softly but seriously, is that true, son? Alex nodded, his eyes downcast. Mom brought us here, he said, his voice shaking slightly. With our things, she told us to wait outside until she left, and then knock on Aunt Gloria's door. The police officers exchanged glances, and I quickly added, I have footage from the security cameras I installed a couple of months ago. There had been break-ins in our neighborhood, so I decided to be on the safe side. I didn't tell anyone about it, not even my family. I pulled out my phone, opened the app, and showed them the video. The footage was clear. Michelle, in her sunglasses, dragging suitcases to the door, talking to the children, then quickly leaving, getting into the car, and driving away, leaving the children standing alone, huddled together, until they decided to knock. I saw the officers watching the footage, and one of them's expressions reflected what I'd felt that morning, a mixture of outrage and bewilderment. This is absolutely clear evidence of child abandonment, the eldest said, shaking his head slightly. I sat on the edge of the couch, feeling a surge of determination building within me. I want to file a report, I said quietly but firmly. and I want this case referred to Child Protective Services." They exchanged glances, and the youngest pulled out forms. They wrote down everything: the time, the details, the names. They took statements from me and the children, a copy of the video recording, and promised that CPS would definitely contact me soon. One of them said before leaving, "The children can stay with you for now, but CPS will have to investigate this situation." When the door closed behind them, silence fell again in the house, but this time it was a different silence, heavy, thick, like the air before a storm. I looked at the three little ones, who had already begun playing on the floor as if nothing had happened, and felt a wave of pity and anger rise. Pity for them, anger at Michelle, and anger at myself, too, for allowing her to drag me back into her chaos. The next day at 10 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock on the door. A woman in her 50s stood at the door, her gaze kind but attentive, a folder tucked under her arm. "Good morning, I'm Janet from CPS." She introduced herself. I led her into the house, offered her coffee, but she declined, smiled, and got straight to the point. She spoke calmly, reservedly, as if she was used to seeing everything there is to see in families. She asked to speak with the children individually, and then with me. I heard her gently ask Alex about school, Emma about where she usually sleeps, and Tyler about who helps him with his homework. When it was my turn, Janet opened her notebook and said, "From what I understand, these children spend most of their time in your care." I smiled bitterly. "Unfortunately, yes, my sister brings them all the time when she has business, dates, or is just in a bad mood, sometimes for a couple of hours, sometimes for weeks. I buy them clothes, pay for extracurricular activities, help with school expenses. Michelle receives child support, but honestly, I'm not sure it's even going to the children." Janet wrote everything down, nodding occasionally, and then said, "We'll open a case to assess the mother's suitability for custody. For now, the children can stay with you. We'll keep in touch." That evening, I was sitting in the kitchen when I heard a sharp knock on the door, hesitant but loud, the kind of knock that conveys irritation and desperation. I opened it, and Michelle burst in without even taking off her coat. "You called CPS on me," she screamed, as if it were the ultimate betrayal. "Are you crazy? Do you realize they can take my children away?" I felt the blood rush to my face. "You left 3 children outside, Michelle, for 10 minutes, unattended. That's abandonment." She took a step toward me, her eyes filled with tears and anger. "Because of you, they could be taken away from me." "Maybe it would be best for everyone," I said quietly. Her face turned red, her lips trembled. "I'm going to take the kids home now," she screamed. "No, you won't," I replied. "The police and CPS said they have to stay here until everything is sorted out. You can't just take them away, you can't hide them from me." She nearly sobbed. "I'm not hiding them, you abandoned them when you left them on the doorstep." Michelle ran out, slamming the door so hard that the dishes in the cupboard clanged. Half an hour later, the phone rang. I knew who it was before I even looked at the screen. "Glories. You've ruined everything." Mom screamed, "Your sister's kids could end up in foster care." I clutched the phone tighter. "Mom, their father contacted me yesterday. CPS notified him of what happened. He's going to sue for custody. He's tired of paying child support to a woman who abandons children at strangers' doors." There was a deathly silence on the other end. I heard only my mother's breathing. "He's going to take full custody, and he's going to stop paying Michelle," I added. "Honestly, that's probably the best thing that could have happened." A click, they hung up. I put the phone down on the table and looked into the living room. Alex, Emma, and Tyler were sitting on the floor, eating popcorn and watching an old cartoon, laughing in unison. For the first time, they looked relaxed, happy, as if they finally had an adult by their side who wouldn't disappear, scream, or abandon them at someone else's door. And in that moment, I realized, it was just beginning. The children stayed with me for a whole month, the longest, but perhaps the quietest and most balanced month I'd ever known. These 3, while the investigation continued and the lawyers prepared documents for the hearing, life in my house took on a predictable rhythm for the first time. There were no chaotic calls in the middle of the night, no unexpected visits from Michelle with her perpetually tired, irritated face and the words, "Glories, just for a couple of days, okay?" Now the days flowed smoothly, like a stream of warm light through the kitchen window in the morning. I worked while the kids were at school, then drove to pick them up at 3, followed by dinner, homework, a bath, and a book before bed. When they, tired, went to bed, I'd sit down with my laptop and catch up on everything I'd missed during the day, listening to Emma snore in the silence and Tyler's teddy bear fall from the top bunk. Gradually, I began to notice changes in the kids themselves. Alex's eyes lost that anxious glint when he'd always listened for footsteps, to see if Mom had come to pick them up in the middle of dinner. Emma started drawing again, sitting on the floor for entire evenings, sketching princesses and puppies, and Tyler, who had barely spoken before, began chatting about everything: school, breakfast, the snowstorm he was eagerly awaiting. They weren't expecting the unknown, they knew the day would end just as it began, and no one would interrupt that rhythm. James, their father, called regularly, sometimes just in the evening to ask how they were doing, sometimes during dinner if he knew I was home. His voice was tired, but there was gratitude in it, genuine, unfeigned. "Glories," he said one day as I cleared the table and the children in the next room argued over who would wash the cups. "I didn't even know it had gotten this bad, that Michelle was constantly leaving the kids with you. I thought it was just a little something, but it turns out it's been going on for over a year. I was paying her $2,500 a month, thinking she really cared about them, and it turns out she was spending the money on her dates and shopping. I'm sorry you had to bear all this on your own." I paused, listening to him sigh on the other end of the line, and then replied, "I don't hold a grudge, James, I just want the kids to be safe, nothing else matters." He thanked me again and said his lawyer was confident he had a good chance of winning full custody. "We can't give them back their lost years, but at least we can give them stability now," he added. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. I took the day off, put on a formal suit, and, standing in front of the mirror in the morning, felt my heart pounding, not from fear, but from a quiet determination, as if I had to tell the truth not for myself, but for the 3 children who had slept in my home for the past few weeks. The courtroom was packed, Michelle and Derek on one side, James with his lawyer on the other, my parents, who sat looking away from me, the Child Protective Services workers, the teachers. Michelle looked tense but confident. She was the first to testify, and when the lawyer asked if she had anything else to add, she wrung her hands and began to cry. "I love my children, I just went through a tough time, I'm a good mother, I needed help, I didn't know it would go this far." Her lawyer continued the same line of thought, portraying me as a woman who had interfered with someone else's family and was now trying to take the children away from their mother. I listened and thought how cleverly words could twist reality. From a lawyer's lips, it sounded like I was the enemy, not the person who had kept the family afloat for years. When it was James's turn, the room seemed to grow quieter. He spoke calmly, but his voice trembled. "Your Honor, I paid child support faithfully for 3 years, believing my ex-wife was the primary caregiver of our children. I didn't know that my sister-in-law, Glories, was actually raising them. She helped them with their homework, fed them, took them to doctor's appointments, and attended all their meetings. While my ex-wife was busy with other things." I felt several people in the room exchange glances, but James didn't stop. "I don't want to take the children away from Michelle, I want them to live where they feel safe and secure." Then they called me in. The prosecutor, a woman with soft eyes and a steely tone, asked, "Ms. Glories, could you describe what a typical week with your children was like for you over the past year?" I took a deep breath and replied, 5 or 6 days a week, sometimes 7. I fed them, helped them with homework, bought them clothes, paid for their extracurricular activities. Michelle dropped them off in the morning and often didn't pick them up until the next day. I never agreed to this, but over time, it just became the norm. Every time I tried to say no, she made me feel guilty, and my parents said I was selfish. And on the day in question, Michelle simply left the 3 children on my doorstep and drove away. She told them to wait 5 minutes before knocking. They were standing outside alone. The judge listened attentively, without interrupting. When I finished, the room became so quiet you could hear someone whispering in the back row. Then they called witnesses from the school, teachers, the principal, Mrs. Patterson, Alex's teacher, confirmed that I was the one listed as the emergency contact, that I had been the one who had come to all the parent-teacher conferences, helped with projects, and even organized the school's winter supply drive. I sat there, looking at Michelle, and suddenly I felt not anger, no, something else, like a complete exhaustion had washed over me. I didn't hate her, I just no longer wanted to be the one who always offered a shoulder to cry on when everyone else turned their back, and for the first time in a long time, I realized that perhaps it was finally time to put an end to this, not for my own sake, but for the sake of those who now called my home. Over 3 years, Mrs. Patterson admitted, she met with me dozens of times, discussing Alex's behavior, his grades, his interest in science, and the way he constantly argued with the teacher over formulas. When the prosecutor asked her how often she spoke with the boy's mother, she answered curtly, twice, just twice in 3 years. Her words sounded simple, without drama, but they struck harder than any accusation. Then Emma's teacher testified, and her testimony was almost identical. Glory's handles school matters, signs permission slips, comes to concerts, helps with projects, picks up the girl when she's sick. I only saw the mother a couple of times, and both times only on the run. Even Tyler's preschool teacher confirmed the same. I was the primary contact for everything from walks to medical certificates, and when she said, if I needed to decide something, I always called Glory's because she responded right away. I felt my eyes sting treacherously, not from pride, but from the fatigue accumulated over the years. My parents, of course, tried to protect Michelle. Mom kept her hands in her lap, as if afraid they would tremble, and said softly, Michelle is a good mother, she's just going through a difficult time, and Dad added, avoiding my gaze, she's trying to build a stable life with a new partner. It's not easy. But when the prosecutor asked to clarify how often the children lived with me, rather than with Michelle, they exchanged glances, hesitated, and couldn't say anything coherent. An awkward silence hung in the courtroom, which no one wanted to break, and in that moment I realized, the truth had been there all along, but no one had dared to say it out loud. The most powerful moment was something I didn't even expect to see. The prosecutor pulled out a flash drive and said, Your Honor, we'd like to show you the security footage. The judge frowned but nodded. The screen flashed from the camera mounted on my porch. I recognized that morning immediately, gray, damp, with a drizzle. Michelle's car pulled up to the curb, the door opened, and 3 children emerged, carrying backpacks. Michelle said something to them, then waved, closed the door, and drove away. The children stood there for a few minutes, shifting from foot to foot, until they approached the door and knocked. The judge watched the footage once, then, after a pause, asked to play it again. His face changed, the detachment gone. He stared at the screen without blinking, and when the recording ended, the courtroom was so silent you could hear someone clicking a pen. Next, the prosecutor presented transcripts of the correspondence. All those messages were Michelle had written to me. Can you take the kids for a few months? I need to focus on my relationship with Derek, or, I'm struggling, I can't cope, just take them for now. The judge frowned and said quietly but clearly, the defendant appears to view childcare as something she can outsource to family members while she pursues her personal interests. The words sounded cold, almost formal, but they were tinged with irritation. Michelle's lawyer tried to salvage the situation, arguing that family support was normal practice, that any mother could ask her sister to babysit if she was struggling, but the judge merely shook his head and said, there's a difference between temporary support and effectively abandoning parental responsibilities, and that difference is clear. After these words, even the lawyer lowered his eyes to the papers, as if he knew arguing was futile. The 2 days of hearings dragged on agonizingly, and yet, when the judge finally retired to deliver his decision, I felt not anxiety but a strange emptiness, as if the air had been sucked out of me. A week later, we were called back into court. Michelle arrived in a light dress, her hair loose, trying to appear calm, but her eyes were red, as if she hadn't slept all night. James sat next to his lawyer, clasping his hands, and I sat slightly behind him, my heart pounding in my temples. The judge entered, and everyone stood. He flipped through the papers, looked at us, and said, based on the evidence presented, The court awards full custody of the 3 minor children to their father, Mr. James Mitchell. The words rang out like a gavel. Even before he brought the hammer down, Michelle buried her face in her hands and began to cry, while my parents sat motionless, as if they couldn't believe it was over. James turned to me, looked at me with gratitude, and nodded quietly. The gesture spoke volumes. The judge continued, explaining that the defendant had consistently failed to provide stable child care, shifting her responsibilities to others, and that the episode of abandoning the child showed a disturbing lack of judgment. Then he added that child support payments would cease, and the father would assume full financial responsibility for the children. I sat there, feeling as if all the tension of the past months was pouring out of me, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to simply exhale. It was over. A few weeks later, James moved the children into his own house, warm, spacious, with white shutters and old oak trees by the porch. He showed me photos, rooms decorated for each child, colorful bedding, books on the shelves, Alex's bike by the garage. The transition was surprisingly peaceful. The children always loved their father, they just needed the reassurance that he was there, that now everything was real. Sometimes they would come to me on weekends, they would make noise, laugh, raid my refrigerator, make their usual mess, and I only felt happy about it. Alex once said to me, "Aunt Glories, I sleep soundly now because I know where I'll be tomorrow." I've always remembered those words, they were worth everything I'd been through. And Michelle, she soon married Derek. The ceremony was quiet, without guests, without invitations. I wasn't invited, and I wasn't offended. On the contrary, I felt better because I could finally let it all go, without blame, without expectations, just let it go and move on with my life. A few months after the trial, I learned that Michelle had given birth to a 4th child, a girl. No one called, wrote, or invited me to the christening, and I hadn't even seen any photos. I only heard from a neighbor that the baby was healthy and looked a lot like Emma as a baby. My parents didn't speak to me. After the trial, it was as if they'd erased me from family conversations, and if I accidentally called my mother, my father would pick up the phone and say curtly, "Mom's busy," followed by a clicking sound, as if he'd simply put it down, while I kept repeating, "Hello." They accused me of ruining Michelle's family, of interfering where it wasn't wanted, but honestly, I didn't care. I couldn't and didn't want to make excuses. I did what I thought was right, and looking at my 3 children, finally safe, I knew I'd done the right thing. Sometimes protecting children requires decisions others won't understand, especially those accustomed to turning a blind eye to the obvious. These children deserved better than being a nuisance in their mother's personal life. 6 months passed, and everything around me gradually changed. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living my own life. After Michelle's divorce, I'd always been caught up in her chaos, the late-night calls, the requests to watch until morning, the endless excuses to my employer about why I was yet again behind on a project. Now, I could work calmly, without constant interruptions, without sudden messages from Michelle. Without anxious anticipation, I started sleeping in on weekends again, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like my life had a rhythm. I could make plans, not someone else's, but my own, and no one would ruin them with a single call. My career, which had been waiting for a break for a long time, suddenly took off. Without constant distractions, I started taking on challenging projects, not just the tame ones. My boss noticed this almost immediately. "Glories, you've literally been transformed," he said, smiling. As he handed me my promotion, I was now a senior engineering manager, and besides a raise, that meant access to the AI projects I'd dreamed of. The workdays were long, but they were satisfying, not draining. And for the first time in a long time, I came home with a slight feeling of pride, not exhaustion. And then Ryan came into my life. We met at a tech conference in Austin. He was standing by the coffee machine, complaining about the quality of the coffee, and I couldn't help but say, "That's not bad, try the tea." He laughed, and that's how it all began. We talked for hours about work, technology, books, how strange it can be to live among people yet sometimes feel lonely. When I told him about Michelle and how I'd spent the last few years essentially raising 3 children, he was silent for a long time, then said, You basically raised other people's children while working full-time. That's incredible. I smiled. It was exhausting, and added, I don't know how single parents cope. He replied, most single parents don't work in a field where they get calls at midnight and don't have relatives to take advantage of their kindness. There was no judgment in his voice, only quiet admiration. And in that moment I realized he was right. I'd lived in an abnormal situation for so long that I'd forgotten what normal life was like. Meanwhile, the children are settling in beautifully with James. He's placed them in good schools with strong programs and attentive teachers. Alex, who had previously been withdrawn, suddenly became more animated, became fascinated with advanced math, and began participating in Olympiads. Emma sang in the school choir, and I recognized her clear voice from the videos they sent. Tyler, the youngest, played in a baseball league and proudly showed me his medals over video calls. Their father truly invested in them, with attention, patience, and genuine interest, and even though I no longer saw them every day, our relationship became warmer and deeper. Every other weekend they came to visit. I no longer felt like an exhausted nanny, always trying to catch up on schedule. Now I could simply be an aunt, someone with whom you could go to the movies, have pajama nights, laugh at silly videos, or just sit on the porch and listen to the wood popping in the fireplace. Alex looked at me one day intently and asked, Aunt Glories, are you happier now? I laughed. Why do you ask? He shrugged. You look more relaxed, you're not tired anymore. And I replied, yes, honey, I'm happier. And you? Do you like living with Dad? Emma immediately interjected, yes. He makes dinner every night, helps with homework, and we don't have to worry about where we'll sleep. I listened and realized, that was what made it all worth it. Michelle, on the other hand, was going through a tough time. I heard from mutual relatives that her marriage to Derek was falling apart. Taking care of a newborn without anyone else to care for the older children was proving much harder than she'd imagined, and now she had to work too. The child support payments had stopped, and Derek, who worked in sales, wasn't bringing home the income she'd hoped for. My cousin Lisa once told me that Michelle had asked her to borrow money for diapers and baby formula. I listened to this without malice, rather, with the bitter feeling that life had finally shown her what I couldn't explain in words. She had built a world in which children were an obstacle to her happiness, and now she herself found herself in a life where no one would lend a shoulder to cry on, and, as strange as it may sound, for the first time in many years, I felt not resentment for her, but pity, a quiet, non-judgmental pity, like pity for someone who had backed herself into a corner. But most of the relatives had already figured it out by then. After the trial, rumors spread quickly. Someone passed on this, someone added that, and eventually everyone knew what had happened, but few wanted to get involved with Michelle again. Those who had previously easily given in to her pleas for help now kept their distance. My parents, however, were still seething with rage. I stopped waiting for their calls and stopped trying to explain. They were so confident in their version of events that any word from me only triggered a new round of accusations. At some point, I simply let go. I stopped communicating. It was painful, but strangely liberating. I was tired of feeling guilty every time I tried to set boundaries, tired of making excuses for not wanting to be convenient again. But the rest of the family slowly began to understand what had really happened. A few months after the trial, my cousin Mark called me, the same one who had previously tried to stay out of all family squabbles. Glories, he said, clearing his throat a little awkwardly, I owe you an apology. We all knew Michelle was taking advantage of you. No one wanted to get involved in that mess. You did what none of us could have done. It took courage. His words touched me more deeply than I expected. I was silent for a few seconds before replying, thank you, Mark. I didn't expect anyone to understand, but it's good to hear. He added, these children are much better now, and frankly, maybe that was just the blow Michelle needed. Maybe now, raising her own child, she'll finally learn responsibility. I listened and thought, how strange that understanding sometimes comes not from sympathy, but from weariness with lies. I hadn't built up any expectations, didn't expect everything to suddenly get easier, but life, as it turns out, has a way of surprising me. A year later, I bought my first house. It was a true miracle, a 3-bedroom, bright, warm place with a spacious kitchen, a large backyard, and a small office by the window where morning sun gilded the table. For a long time, I couldn't believe it was all mine. When I opened the door and inhaled the smell of fresh paint and new furniture, I had that special feeling. As if I'd finally arrived where I belonged, I invited James and the kids to the housewarming party. They burst in noisily, shouting and laughing. Emma, as soon as she stepped through the door, shouted, "Aunt Glories, this place is absolutely amazing," and immediately ran across the backyard, with Tyler chasing after her, shouting that he could be the first to have the room with the view of the tree. "Thanks, buddy," I laughed, hugging Alex. "You'll always have your own rooms here when you arrive." James stood in the doorway, watching the children, then quietly said, "Can I speak with you for a minute?" We stepped aside, and he looked at me with an expression that was a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. "Glories, I probably can never thank you enough for what you did. I know it cost you your relationship with your parents and sister." I shrugged, but he continued, "I understand that those were unhealthy relationships, and, I think you're actually better off without all that drama." I nodded, he smiled, and added, "The kids are doing great. Alex got an honorary position at school. Emma is one of the best students in her class. Tyler is doing great too. The coach said he's a natural leader. They're happy, and it all started with you. You saved them from years of chaos." When he said that, I suddenly felt something inside me unravel, as if a knot that had been tying me down for years had finally loosened. Looking back, I realized that standing up to Michelle was perhaps the most important decision of my life, not just for the children, but for myself as well. For years, I allowed her to violate my boundaries, condoning her irresponsibility because I was afraid of being a bad sister. I thought love meant enduring, but true caring sometimes requires saying no, especially when the well-being of those who can't protect themselves depends on it. Michelle always assumed I wouldn't refuse, that I'd be there, always available, ready to pick up the pieces if she ruined everything again. She went so far as to literally leave the children in my arms, confident that, as usual, I couldn't refuse, and for a long time, I really couldn't. I thought that by helping, I was doing good, but there comes a time when you have to choose. Either you continue to play along with someone else's dysfunction, or you protect those who suffer from it. These 3 children deserved more than being an obstacle to their mother's next love. They deserved a parent who would be there for them, not someone who saw them as a burden, and now they had that, and I had my life. I was proud that I didn't break under pressure. That I could withstand the scorn, condemnation, and silence of those I once considered close. It wasn't easy, and it cost me more than I'll ever admit, but I knew it was the right thing to do. Sometimes, sitting on the porch of my new house with a cup of coffee, I think about how it all turned out, about how standing up for what's right isn't just courage, it's a kind of liberation. After all, not everyone can be convinced, and not everyone can be kept close. Sometimes you have to let go, accept that someone will never forgive you for speaking the truth. But living honestly is far more valuable than continuing a relationship built on guilt and manipulation. I finally felt free, and perhaps for the first time in many years, I could say without a shadow of a doubt, I was living the life I had chosen.